Good afternoon. This is Debbie Q, and you're listening to The Right Shoe. The Right Shoe is a podcast about all things strange and unusual, especially in reference to a death. Don't forget, I'm going to do all my show notes to the end so we can jump right into this, especially because this is, wow. This story, each time I think I've got to the craziest one, I come to this one. This is the story of Cindy James. Who is Cindy James, you might ask? Cindy James is somebody who on June 8th, 1989, was found in the quiet Vancouver, British Columbia suburb of Richmond, dead. The 44-year-old nurse was hog-tied, drugged, strangled. Hog-tied meaning her hands and feet had been tied behind her back. And she was found in an abandoned house a few miles from where her car had been found. The police ruled it suicide, which starts off the very bizarre case of Cindy James. To show you how bizarre it gets, this is one of the messages that was allegedly left for Miss James. Now, I don't know about you, but that's a disturbing message. It says, Cindy, dead meat. For 7 years, this woman had been tortured. This story is beyond complex. I mean, okay, first of all, I cannot believe of all the cases I've done so far, yes, like the Lex Street Massacre, which was in Philadelphia, really didn't have a lot on it, and it was difficult to find. Not that it wasn't horrific, but it was a straight, even though it's questionable why the people did what they did, there was no question that these people were murdered in the Lex Street Massacre. Where this case, it's so bizarre, I'm surprised that the 2 books that I found that were written about this woman, they're not in print anymore. And it's a shame because the one book I was able to get called Who Killed Cindy James by Ian Mulgrew. It was pricey. It was like $40, but I had to get it. I just needed to read the whole story. And because what was on the internet, you can, depending on the way you tell this story, you can really put somebody to one way or the other. You can really make it look a certain way. I really wanted to give everything that I could get my hands on. This was a famous Unsolved Mysteries episode to start off when Robert Stack, who I absolutely, I love Unsolved Mysteries. Unsolved Mysteries and Forensic Files, hands down, 2 best crime shows ever. Nobody will ever be able to beat either of them, period. I don't know if it's because they were the first of its kind or what, but they're fantastic. This case is just so famous due to this Unsolved Mysteries episode. Cindy James, they portrayed on Unsolved Mysteries that she was this, the parents, of course, were outraged. The way they portrayed it, the writer of the other book, which was titled The Deaths of Cindy James, which was written by a Neil Hall. Now, Neil Hall was a Canadian reporter, and he had a distinct idea of what happened to Miss James. Now, I could not get a hold of that book. I heard it's fantastic. The book was $140, the cheapest that I could find. And though I was very close to spending that $140, I still want to get a look at it because he was on the Unsolved Mysteries episode and he really had this definitive idea of what happened. And I can't say that he didn't make sense. It's unusual. It is unusual in that, this case. So I wanted to read both. I got the one, Who Killed Cindy James, but I actually like the way this was written. Again, it's by Ian Mulgrew. It was a bit cheaper. I did see it on Amazon, I think for $45 at this point. It is actually worth it because he portrays both sides and he really gets into it. And I am telling you, it's just bizarre. I'll start right now. Cindy James was born in British Columbia to Otto and Tilly Hack. The reason her name is different, at one point she was Cindy Makepeace because she does get married. She did eventually change her name and try to move to get away from what was happening. I don't think it worked out too well, but regardless, she grew up. She was a beautiful woman. In the end, she didn't look so good, but the stress and everything you could see it in her face. And if you, of course, I'll have pictures on my website, therightstopodcast.com. If you Google Cindy James, you can see there's pictures of her in the end of her life. She looks terrible. I mean, the stress really overcame her in the end. Although there was a brief respite towards the end as well. So it even makes the story even more confusing. So she grew up. Later on, her and her sister discussed the father and the mother, and there was a little bit of issues, but nothing that seemed totally, I don't know, everyone has something when they grow up. Everybody. There's always something that you have to overcome, or I can't think of one person I ever met that had this totally perfect childhood. And then some are worse than others. I mean, that's agreed. I just, her, from what I could gather, her life, her dad seemed a little distant. But beyond that, I think one of them might have had an affair. Beyond that, I don't see much evidence of this, her childhood being crazy or out of control, depressing, or to cause her to what happened. Like, she had a lot of mental issues, without a doubt, but was it because she was doing it to herself, or is it because somebody was doing this to her? She grew up with brothers and sisters. I know she had a sister, Melanie, and another sister. Let me see. Mostly mentions her sister, Melanie, though I know she had another sister. I'm not sure she had any brothers. But they grew up. Otto was I think he was like an army kind of guy, tough guy, hard to get through to that reserve. 1966, she graduated nursing school. A few years later, she was named administrator for a preschool for children who had emotional and behavioral disorders. And she was apparently very good with these children. She did not have any children of her own, and she was married to a guy named Roy Makepeace, but they would get divorced. It was after this divorce that trouble started. She started to receive things in the mail. They were disturbing pictures of people being strangled, or she was getting obscene phone calls. The first phone call that she received, she called the police, actually. The guy had said to her, she received a phone call, then she called the police, and then the next message she got was, "Cindy, so you think calling the police will keep you safe? You wait, I've got my zipper open. I'm talking to my throbbing." And at this point, she hung up. She called the police again. They responded, and there was a patrol car waited as Cindy unpacked and left the night to spend with friends. Then other disturbing things began to happen. She would come in. Someone had broken into her house, slashed her pillowcase. She told uniform officers in the beginning that she didn't think it was her estranged husband. But they were like, why would just some guy come and destroy a pillowcase? There was no indication of forced entry. There was not even dust had been. Everything was okay. There was really no point of entry. So after a couple times, they started to get suspicious, but they got suspicious, especially this one police officer named Pat McBride. He became suspicious that it was her ex-husband because he was thinking, well, how else could they get in, and why would they destroy a pillow? And that makes sense. I can see that. And it became apparent that Cindy was a pretty lady. The guy seemed to want to take care of her. Well, Pat McBride moved in with Cindy, but it created a lot of complications because actually after this stuff kept going on, these bizarre photographs, these constant threats, Pat McBride actually said that he did receive some of the phone calls, but this is the only evidence that was available was his word, some people started to become suspicious of him. So we have so far Pat McBride and Roy Makepeace that the police were starting to get suspicious of. Cindy kept saying, no, it can't be them, either of them. Now, during this time, there was a lot of names that are going to come around, and because some were on her side, some weren't. Now, things got worse and worse. Allegedly, there was a cat that was strangled and left on her front doorstep, and this wasn't the first time that animal cruelty would happen. And she was, of course, I mean, that right after that, I don't know what I'd do. Oh, that's awful. You know, as this was going on, she started to get more and more panicked. So she wanted to hire an investigator besides just Tom McBride, because I don't know. I think Tom McBride was getting like ribbed at the station, like, oh, you're helping Cindy out, wink, wink. And that relationship was starting to get a bit strained because of this. So she actually got a hold of some guy named Ozzy Caban, and he had been a bodyguard of the royal family, but also American people such as Jane Fonda. He had like significance in the community as somebody who would help you out if you needed it. So he said he would help her out. And then one day he took her case, and the calls were continuing. He came over to her house, and he could not get a hold of her. He looked through her window and he saw her body. He thought she was dead. He went inside the home. He found Cindy lying on the floor in a pool of blood. She had been stabbed in the left hand with a paring knife, and a note had been attached to the paring knife, and it was threatening her, as usual, with death, murder, well, we're going to kill you. He couldn't even detect a pulse. He thought she was dead still, but then he found out she was only unconscious. He didn't notice this nylon stocking wrapped around her throat. It was so tight that it was within the folds of her skin. He had called the police and the EMTs, and when they came, they actually found this black nylon stocking, and they cut it from her, and they resuscitated her. There was a bump on her head. There was really not any significant injury, but of course this is alarming. They took her to the hospital. They also found a needle mark in her right arm that led them to believe that she had been injected with something. They didn't find anything, so she was released from the hospital. Now, during this investigation, I don't understand why. Okay, let's backtrack a little bit. So the police are sure it's Makepeace, her ex-husband. They are freaking out on Roy Makepeace. This is around the time when Cindy started to also accuse him of this. Now, we've all heard of false confessions and such, and when I think of this, I thought, well, why would she say it wasn't him and then suddenly him? Was she trying to protect him? Then I thought, well, if the police kept drumming into her head, it's Roy Makepeace, it's Roy Makepeace, maybe she thought, well, if I just say that, because it was starting to there was starting to become a pattern where it was happening over and over again. 18 months had gone by, and the police couldn't find anybody. They kept saying, it's got to be Makepeace. So now she's saying it's Makepeace. They bring Makepeace into the police station, and he is flipping out. He was literally stunned. He said, I would never do such a thing. He became so freaked out that he started writing all of these letters to the father, claiming it was the mob. I don't know where he quite got that, but he did make an interesting observation. He said maybe it is one of the children, because apparently Cindy, where she worked with the mentally challenged children, the parents, I guess, sometimes would be in custody issues. So she would say whether or not this parent or that parent deserved more custody. That's actually a great observation. He said, it's probably one of those parents, and now they're torturing her. Although to the lengths that it would become, I don't know. But this is where they really were honing in on Roy Makepeace, and he just kept saying, it's just not me. It's not me. After this interrogation, actually, he wrote a 4-page letter to the father saying that her life, her sanity were at risk and law enforcement are lying to you. It's not me. I'm an easy victim. And he was very much, he was crying. He kept saying initially he kept saying it was the mob until he said it probably is one of the parents. This guy seemed really rattled, obviously, by being named as the person of interest in this whole case. And actually, 5 years later, when the ultimate tragedy would happen, Makepeace would still be the only person they really had of interest, except that by that time, when some of the larger incidents happened, he wasn't even home. And I guess people could say, well, maybe he paid somebody to torture his ex-wife. That's debatable, except the police just never found any fingerprints or, they started to sit outside her house. They would wait for anybody to come to do something, and they would sit out for weeks. Nothing would happen. And then when they weren't there, something would happen again. So it was extremely frustrating. It got to the point where when she was in the hospital, they finally, now this is what I read, that mostly men had been interviewing her, and they really felt sorry for her. She would start to cry. I think it is hard, genuinely, for a man to see a woman crying. It's probably a helpless feeling. I'm a woman, and I have to say, if a guy is in front of me and I felt like I needed sympathy, you do. Like, if you're in that position and you want sympathy and you just start crying, it is nice for a guy to say, oh my God, I feel for you. I want to help you. It's nice to hear that when you're stressed out or just whatever, especially what was happening with her. So finally they sent a female officer, and this woman, she just didn't like Cindy right off the bat. Her name was Karen Ann Halliday. She goes to the hospital. She said, I didn't believe her for a second. From the minute I met her, I thought she was doing all of this to herself. Now, whether that stems where all the initial thought that this was her, I don't know. But I do know that she was like, if they would just pressure her, maybe she would finally come forth and admit either who she really thought it was, or if it was her, or if she had something to do with it, or if she was into some kind of masochistic game with her ex. They were thinking of all kinds of things because it was consistent for a couple years now with they would find her, tied up with these nylon stockings or being mailed this trash or and actually she did not know that they were going to do this. She had many obscene phone calls, she said. Well, one time the operator put a trace on the call, and Cindy didn't know this. So she called and said, they called me again. And the operator, when the police said, well, where was the call coming from? They said it was her. She called her own self. Now, I don't know how she did that unless she had 2 separate numbers. I remember phones back then. If you called your own phone, you would get a busy signal. But they said she had called her own self, and she did not know that they were tracing that call. So that was interesting. That was when the police, between that and the female officer, I really think they were just beginning to doubt her, and they were starting to get frustrated. During this time, her sister Melanie said that they had like a little conversation about the parents and growing up. And this is when they started to kind of talk about how growing up with the parents were. Melanie said to her sister, I really was always afraid of Dad, and you were always the strong one. Melanie was saying this to Cindy. And then they cried together. The tears were coming in, and I think it released some of the tension for Cindy. But it was interesting that they had both felt the same way, that growing up, they felt that the parents weren't really there for them emotionally or physically. That was also a time when, it's people are, I can't say this guy, Otto, seemed like this bad guy. I mean, he was outraged on unsolved mysteries. I mean, so it wasn't like he didn't care about his daughter. He just probably had a tough exterior. I don't know. But to them, to Melanie and Cindy, they felt that growing up, they really could never go to their father. So when the police kind of blamed Cindy for holding stuff back because she failed multiple lie detector tests, multiple. They said, you're holding something back. Now, even Ozzy Caban had said he did feel like she was holding something back. And then she finally said, well, I am. He actually keep the person on the phone when they call me, they keep saying, look, I'm going to kill your mom and your sister and your family. And she said, that's what's happening. That's why I'm so upset. I don't want anything to happen to my family because of me, because of what this person is doing to me. Caban, even though the police at this point were very frustrated and were starting to disbelieve her, Caban never lost his faith in her. And he brings up an interesting thing that happened. He came into the house one day, and again, he finds her. He entered the house and he found a sexually explicit note on the floor wishing Cindy a happy birthday. A cigarette, which wasn't Cindy's brand, was butted on the bedroom windowsill. The dog that she had, who was named Heidi, had a string around its neck, and she had been beaten and sitting in her own feces. And she was bloody. I mean, this is heartbreaking. I mean, this poor animal. And this is something Caban saw with his own two eyes. And he said when he took the string off of the dog ran right to Cindy. And his thoughts were she would not have done that if Cindy was the person who did that to her. And that convinced him that Cindy was not staging these incidences. But the cops, again, they said you cannot accurately predict how an animal or otherwise would act when this is done. Me and my questions to homicide, I said, what do you think? And they were like, Deb, it's hard to say because you could beat a child and the first person they're going to go to is their abuser. Same with an animal. And as tough as that is for me to believe, because my head was running circles around this case. And every time I went this way, I went the other way. It is really confusing to me, but I cannot imagine a dog after you beat the dog and it was sitting in its own feces tied up, that it would run to its owner. I don't know. Would it? It's an excellent question. And when we're trying to decipher, we'll go at the end to what suicide, homicide. Again, she said there was prowlers. The phone lines were cut 4 days later. She was attacked again. Even though she was out very late at night, walking around alone, they said, if she's so afraid of these men or these unknown, I shouldn't say man, a man or female that are attacking her, why would she be walking around the streets at 3 a.m. to take a walk? It doesn't, nothing made sense. She was a series of contradictions. It was getting worse and worse. With each new attack, she was becoming even more evasive. Now, it's interesting to note that the police told her to keep journals. And in one of the journals, she had wrote, and this is directly from her journal, woke up from a nightmare just before 3 a.m. I started to let go and would feel my throat tighten like I was being strangled. My heart started to pound and I had to get up and check that the bedroom door was locked, even though I checked it already. I still can't sleep with the lights off. I keep thinking about the time I was almost strangled and how powerless I was to fight back and how terrified I was. I keep hearing Roy's voice and his crazy laughter. God, how I hate him. Now that's a mystery to me, how suddenly Roy became the sole focus of everything at this point. And in the beginning, she had been defending him. So it gets very deep. It got so bad for her. it became so incredulous, and just her whole life was becoming about this constant disruption, to the point where eventually her work even let her go. And that just devastated her. She said, I feel they lost a good employee. I can't believe they did that to me. You know, she lost her job, I guess, because she couldn't even work at this point. She said that they kept sending her back and forth to centers for psychiatric care. And one of the forensic psychiatrists said he was 99% certain Cindy was doing this to herself. She was psychologically disturbed, and she had a constant need for recognition and attention. Although one of the things that happened to her was a knife. Now this, please, if this is a trigger, if sexually explicit material is a trigger, what I'm about to say next is pretty scary. A knife had been inserted into her vagina, and there was evidence that twigs were shoved up her rectum, and a cigarette had been butted out into her vagina as well. Now, if she was doing this to herself, this is really very frightening. I just don't know why. I can't imagine your need for attention is that bad that you're going to do this to yourself. It really did get crazy. After these incidences, she would never feel the same again. And there was an interesting thing that was brought up, I have to say. If this, God forbid, was her doing this to herself, what triggered this? You know, getting a divorce? I can't imagine. I mean, it is weird that, like, Roy said, you know, one time he couldn't get it up, and she was so pissed off that she had an affair with a younger man. I mean, that's like rooted in fact. That is a factual thing that came out in the divorce proceedings. I mean, that shows a lot of anger. I could see being a little ticked, but to have an affair, just but listen, honest to God, I still don't know what to think. This case, it just baffles me. So now she had gone to treatment so many times. She said at this point, I didn't want to deal with anybody. I didn't want to talk to anybody. I was tired of going to all these doctors and just being told that I was crazy. She did eventually go to a St. Paul's hospital because she was a suicide risk, but they actually stabilized her here. And there was a doctor his name was Dr. Friesian. He got her onto a maintenance program of antidepressants and sedatives, and she only had to go to the local pharmacy to obtain if she ran out. And for almost a year, almost a year, she was okay. So she got herself together and she got a nursing job. Now, she wasn't the administrator anymore. And this is when her journals take on now her journals were never really read in life. They were only read after she had passed away. So this was unknown at the time, but this is very interesting. First of all, she hated nursing. She said it was dreary and repetitious. She felt like crying. The job was unfulfilling. She couldn't stand it. She wanted to be back where she had been before. And she's just tired of feeling like an orderly just handing out pills. Then she says something even more interesting. She had a lot of difficulty dealing with battered and abused women. She said that on one instance when she had to take care of there was 2 policemen that were bringing in an abused woman who had just been assaulted by her husband. She said she felt her stomach heave and she thought she was going to vomit. She kept swallowing until it went away. She had a panic attack. The first time it had happened in that ward. It didn't last long, and she got it under control. But she just said she felt a lot of contempt for the woman that had been abused. That is interesting. And that could go deeply. I mean, just because it's contempt doesn't mean it's contempt for the woman per se, even though it felt like it. Is it contempt because she felt like she was in that same position? These were brought up by the psychiatrist and people in general that were close to her. She had become close to a couple named Agnes Woodcock and Tom. They stayed with her. Now, one night, there had been a fire that was set. And this was kind of the beginning of the end. She, she said she heard a noise, she ran down because they had been staying with her. And she told Tom Woodcock that she heard a noise. He said he heard it too. Well, then they found out that there was smoke and the house was on fire. He said that he ran outside. He saw somebody standing or staring at the fire. And he told the gentleman to please get the police. And the person ran. So, between Pat McBride saying he answered the phone when there were during a few obscene phone calls, you have Woodcock saying that he saw a gentleman outside during this fire. And then you have Caban, who said the dog who was sitting in his own feces and beat ran to her. I mean, those are things in her favor because there's a lot of things that aren't in her favor. And one of them is this. The house is on fire. They really, arson investigators came, the police came, and they said that it was started by somebody on the inside, which didn't make her look good because when she tried to blame Roy Makepeace for it, she found out that he had been in Europe the entire time, and it could not have been him unless he paid somebody to set her house on fire. But again, they said, the arson investigator said it came from within the house. And there was no point of entry for that night. There was just nothing around it. There was no, again, they checked every, window, door. Maybe it was an accidental fire. I don't know. But then when I think that, again, the arson investigator said it had come to their conclusion that it was started by somebody in the house. I did not see anything, or I would have written it down. I didn't see any gasoline found or something like that. I'm just going by what he said. But at this point, I have to say, no matter what, they had it in their head that Cindy was doing this herself. So, poor Cindy. That is a mess. And here is something that now they had brought up. I'm starting to get into, the what ifs and what have yous. They said, I think the police just all these years, they couldn't find anything that even remotely pointed to anybody else except for Makepeace because he was the ex-husband and he always seemed to blame it on the mob, but he comes off as a very, not a strong character. From what I've read about him, I hate to say weak character, he just doesn't come off. He was in the army, and he very much has a soldier mentality. People that are I have to break from this for 1 second. There was a Forensic Files episode, and I will never forget, it had to do with a guy, he had raped a woman, and they said it was the husband. And the woman even thought it was the husband because of the way that night happened. I would have to find that Forensic Files episode because it's actually very good. But the point is that husband went to jail. He had been a Marine. The guy who actually raped her said when he saw that guy was a fellow Marine, he went to the police and said, I did it. And I cannot let a fellow Marine go down for something that I did. And that is a thread that I see, especially with the Marine branch of the armed forces. They really stick together. It's almost like a fraternity. Armed forces, again, especially the Marines, I hope I'm pronouncing Semper Fi. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. But they really stick together. And Roy Makepeace was a soldier, and 9 times out of 10, they are pretty stand up. So I'm not saying that he didn't do it, because I'm telling you, honest to God, my brain is like a ping pong ball with this case. This is the first case that I've done on the show, and I do not have a definite opinion. I want to lean towards, I hate even saying this because some of the things are so bizarre. And maybe because I had watched that one episode of Unsolved Mysteries as a child, and the one reporter was so convincing that it was Cindy, but there's some things I can't get past. I am planning to do it on Jon Benet in the future, because there's certain cases that the overwhelming evidence says one thing, and yet there's the one thing that I can't get past. Same with Ellen Greenberg. Although I kind of still feel that she committed suicide. Her stabbing herself, if you ever want to listen to Ellen Greenberg, is in the Right Shoe podcasting. But I often think, she stabbed herself in the neck. There's always that one thing that bugs me. And with Cindy James, more so than how they found her in the end, and I'll get to that too, is that dog running to her. Even homicide, though they swear to me that it happens, I can't get past her, first of all, beating a dog when she loves animals. And that's probably one of the few things, like when you love animals, that's one of the few things that never breaks your heart. Animals are always there for you and nobody else is. So for her to beat a dog and then that dog to run back to her, that bothers me more than any other thing. Even the freaking twigs up her vagina, which is tremendously disturbing. I can't get past that dog running to her. It really does cause one pause. And fortunately, I can say that usually I correlate the stories with something that's happened to me, and I have to say, thank God, nothing in my life reminds me of any of this. I mean, this is whether or not she did it to her, whether or not she had, they did suggest multiple personalities, which that's, it could have been a multiple personality. It could have been somebody else. Could have been her. And it could have been, they call it gang stalking, which there was a couple incidences where people just torture someone that they either don't know or have had a brush with. But in terms that, like the Urban Dictionary, when I looked it up, they said it's usually used in reference to online harassment that is so bad that some people have killed themselves. Yet gang stalking, they did bring that up in one of the articles I read. They said, could it have been now we use the term gang stalking, but could it have been an old, a gang stalking from that day? Somebody that just wanted to torture her? It's possible. That the only reason that's my least guess is because I think the police would have found some shred of evidence, something, because they really did focus on her for quite some time. I think even that private eye, Caban, would have seen some evidence of it and been like, here. He just feels like he never could find who was doing this. And a lot of them that believed that she wasn't doing it did think it was her husband. That all being said, I just cannot. Now, okay, I'll tell you also what could have happened, but let's finish. Okay, so the house is on fire. Woodcock says that he saw somebody, and when he said, call the police, they ran. That's very interesting. Oh, so she wrote to Ozzy Caban. This is from Cindy. Ozzy, this is a letter that is coming from Who Killed Cindy James by Ian Mulgrew. I owe you a debt of gratitude. I'm paraphrasing a bit. I will never forget you or the friendship and believe that you extended to me. I know you're a man of honor. You are no longer obligated, but I have great respect and gratitude for the warmth and friendship. I would like to write to you from time to time if this wouldn't be awkward for you. Also, please bill me so I can start paying you back, because she owed him a fortune, apparently. And he was just like, I could not, in good conscience, just leave this poor woman just die, because he could see what was coming, One of my deepest sorrows and greatest angers is that you've been dirtied by trying to help me. So obviously, his name had been somewhat soiled by his defense of her. Throughout 1988, after the fire, this was 2 years later, she had been found unconscious in her garage. She was naked from the waist down, and a black nylon stocking was wrapped around her neck. Her hands and feet were bound with another stocking. She was taken to the hospital. I think Caban had, I'm sure of it, Caban had found her. She had said she had been in her car, the carport, for several minutes, but when she opened the door, someone grabbed her from behind. She activated Caban's panic button. Responding, police officer found her half in, half out of the car. There was an investigator, his belief that it was another one of Cindy's stunts, but he had been unable to prove it. His conclusion, he was just as perplexed as everybody else. I mean, this was a real mystery. They thought that he was going to be able to figure out what she had done, and he couldn't. He says that even this time, the way she was knotted up, she could not have tied herself up in this manner. It is very, very confusing. So then she disappears, and they can't find her for quite a while. When they finally do find her, she's dead. There's a guy named Gordon, and I guess he was a roofer, a construction worker. He finds Cindy. There's like flies buzzing around her, so it's obvious that it's an old body. The RCMP, or the Canadian police, they come over. They saw that she was hogtied, and she was lying on her right side. She was wearing a pink blouse, maroon pants, and brown nylons. She appeared to have been sitting on her jacket and fell over to the right side. Her left shoe was 2 feet away. Not the right one, the left one this time. A blue jacket was spread with the outer side to the ground, and the lapels were facing up. The blouse had been cut, torn slightly in several places above mid-back, but there was no evidence of a struggle. There was no foreign material. It was not disheveled. The pathologist examined the body and noted that 2 hands tied behind her back were close together, and with 1 finger had scratched another down to the bone. So the finding led the pathologist to believe that the woman had been alive at the scenes, and she checked for signs of wound and other injuries. There was no visible injuries. She collected the bugs and everything to estimate the time of death. And she said it was baffling because nothing was really tight. Like, she could have easily escaped it. There was no bounds that had even left an indent. Her right sleeve was torn. They examined the body under an ultraviolet light. Several hairs and fibers were present, but nothing ever came of that. And they called immediately. The police called it an elaborate suicide, which, at this point, I think they just were at their wits' end. And because the one thing that I didn't say in the beginning, and I've listened to a few things about Cindy, and when they mention dead cats, they don't mention that no one had ever seen these dead cats. The only one to see a hurt animal was Ozzy Caban with the dog. Nobody had ever seen the cats. These are in her journal. Police had told her to write a journal down and to write down everything that was happening to her. She stopped writing in it when she found out that nobody was reading it. So take for that what you will. That itself is pretty strange. The FBI had went over that phone call in the beginning, Cindy, you're dead meat, and they said they don't even know if it was a male or a female voice. And of course, the father was just furious about the way they had treated Cindy. They're just furious. Everyone had been doing their own investigations to try and figure out what happened. And yet, even in the very end, It's up in the air. It's an unknown incident. What she had actually died from, the final toxicology report, she had overdosed on morphine, flurazepam, and diazepam. Now, morphine, of course, is heroin, and the only other thing that shows up as morphine is codeine. And I don't think that was codeine she taken. It's probably, morphine itself or heroin. Diazepam is Valium. Flurazepam, I had never, that's also a type of it's a benzo. It's a benzodiazepines are it's in the benzo family. It's like a Valium or a Xanax, and it's used to treat insomnia. So that's what she had died of, a cocktail. Cindy had swallowed a minimum of 20 and maybe 80 tablets or capsules. There was only a small amount of the Valium in her system, but it would have exasperated the flurazepam because they're both in that family. Now she had always been seen with these little injection marks. So some people had brought up the notion that she was a drug addict, and back then they really didn't test you for drugs ever. So unless, of course you were dying, it was not like a work thing that they do all the time now. So they said it could have taken her as long as 30 minutes before she lost consciousness. Now she went on an upswing, which kind of is very common with suicides. You go on this little upswing right before you do it. Now they have here, so this might be a Canadian thing. I'm not sure. I guess I did see morphine in tablet form a very long time ago. It was a morphine pill. Well, morphine is available both orally in doses of up to 60 milligrams and as an injectable liquid. Cindy had never been prescribed morphine, nor had anybody ever said it was missing, but that doesn't mean she couldn't get a hold of it. And I often thought that too. Could she have been a secret drug addict, massively addicted to drugs? Some of the things, the amount of, 7 years of torturing your own self. I don't think she did this consciously. Although I guess there are multiple personalities, but wow, it's such a crazy story. Every time you think you have it, you read something different. The implication of the toxicology report was indeed just disturbing. If Cindy committed suicide, she would have had to consume all of these sedatives, an ounce of morphine, tied a stocking around her neck, bound her hands and feet, and then passed out. And plus, she had a gift wrapped and groceries in her car. So, she bought groceries and a gift for her, I think it was for her friend's daughter or child. I bought this present now. I decided I'm going to kill myself instead. It doesn't really add up. It just doesn't add up. Makepeace was devastated. I am just going through and trying to make sure there's nothing. So she died. A couple things I just want to note that were bizarre. Before she was found dead, there was an incident where a note had been found in Richmond General Hospital where she had worked, and it said, "Soon, Cindy, and sleep well." It was written on her windshield backwards so that Cindy, when she got in the car, she could read it. That is freaking weird. Could she have been, there's several assessments that they did. People said she did have a lot of disorders. And yet, also, I wanted to mention one thing. Like I said, she said she was terrified and all this, and all these things are happening, and she was walking around 3 a.m, which is odd. Also, what I found odd was there was a guy named Richard Johnston. She had rented her basement out to a stranger, and his name was Richard Johnson, and the police did come to him when she died, and he was cleared. But I just thought that was odd too. Her behavior was so bizarre. To be so terrified, you can barely move, and yet you're letting people stay in your basement. But yet, to do all of these things to yourself for 7 years, I have to say this, because I really have to think about this. I have been for the last, I've been researching this for, a pretty long time, and I've seen this, this is something I've always listened to. It's been years. And I always thought the way that Unsolved Mysteries had portrayed it, I thought she did this to herself. But after reading what I read, I just don't know. That just goes far and above of anybody's tolerance. Unless she did have multiple personalities, but I don't even know who I would think would do it. It couldn't have been Makepeace. He just comes off as just not, I don't know, maybe it was him, and he just came off as like a kind of a wimply guy, and he wasn't really. Oh, gosh, I almost forgot. See, because there's so much to this case, and I don't want to forget anything. She had said in one of her instances when she was with the police that they went on vacation one time, and her sister, they went on vacation one time, and she said when they were married, and he killed and dismembered people while they were on vacation. Now, this sounds like, oh my God, maybe he was the serial killer, until it was known that her sister, Melanie, was with them on the vacation, and she loved Cindy. I mean, they were extremely close, and she said there's just no way that could have happened. She was with them the whole time, and she saw nothing. That's what I mean. Like, you go this way, and then it's like, no, you can't, it's really, truly bizarre. I don't know what to make of this case, and it's driving me crazy. I always have a very definite opinion of things, and I just don't know what to make of this. This Cindy James case is bizarre. One thing I know, and this is what I wanted to say, no matter what happened to Cindy James, she was tortured. Whether it was her or somebody else or Makepeace, she was tortured. I mean, this poor woman. And there's one thing, I'm going to put pictures on the rightshoepodcast.com of what she looked like when she was in the beginning. I mean, she was a pretty lady until the end, where she was, and they kept using this expression, bag of bones, and she looked terrible. I mean, her face was so downtrodden, defeated. It is truly heartbreaking. I hate to end on this note, because I usually have a theory. Even with Marilyn, I have a theory. And this one, I don't know. I just don't know. If you have any ideas, please send them to my Instagram, which is shopaholicdeb44. Because I am a shopaholic. I do have the free book giveaway coming up, and you will have just enough time to get into it, because it's coming out before October 1st. And October 1st is when I spin the wheel, and a lot of people entered it this month, so that wheel's going to be tight. It's a great book, The Cases That Haunt Us by John Douglas. It's something I had doubles of, and I'm going to find one for the month after. I have tons and tons of books. And my Twitter is bookshopworm1. These were all my former websites. I've always been a shopaholic and a bookworm, so I've always had numerous websites. And for the podcast, it's therightshoepodcast.com. And all of my podcasts are on there, or my Instagram has all of them embedded under my profile. So it was lovely, as usual, talking with you. Oh, I wanted to add, if there's anybody that has a theory about Cindy, I would love to hear it, because I'm truly baffled. So please email me, debbieq@therightshoepodcast.com. If you go to therightshoepodcast.com, it's on the first page right there. People email me all the time, or Instagram, shopaholicdeb44. I get a lot of comments there. That's been picking up. Instagram. I find it's really good to, there's a lot of close community of podcasters on there that's pretty enjoyable. So this is Debbie Q, and you're listening to The Right Show. Okay, I'm going to do this quick because this is about the 10th time I've done it. I just want to say at the end, I'm getting new equipment, and I had mentioned Mayhem before. Now that is a little bit out of the ordinary. Not the beginning story with Pal Olin. Those who know it well. There's a story with Pal and Euronymous. That was in 1993 in the beginning of Mayhem, or 92. I am going to do that story, but I also interviewed Attila from Mayhem, and I'm going to do something experimental. I don't want to go into anything more, but that is coming up for Halloween this October. Now, this is Debbie Q, and you're listening to The Right Show.